see the parking.
That's the list. There's shade. Which is really just sidewalk. It's a connecting piece that sort of runs along the south. Connects the two sides.
Now, are you talking about the trail that runs like just outside the gates?
Yeah,
I see all the grass, the park area. Well, that's how we get, that's how I get from our house to across Wisconsin, from our house, across it on Battery. Then I take a little.
Yes.
Eventually I get up to go choice.
That's not an easy.
Right, right. I told her that she, when she, I want to think. So I'm gonna take her, but I told her what I'll do. She won't like it. Oh, from the line, we can. It's not.
Then go past all the this.
That's right.
Then it cuts off. There is actually.
Everything you want to. So I don't want to do at that point, it's like someone.
Go over to. Actually. I don't know if they're talking there. I figured out. I get it here on the road. Well, that's what I do today. You go all the way up to the very end. You go down, so go over the block, you rock the pipe.
Yeah.
And then cross over. And go down to the street called.
Oh, I know.
Go down Flanders.
Oh, wait, I'm thinking.
It's targeting something. I'll show you.
No, I'll look it up.
I understand it takes you through that neighborhood and it dumps you out on, I think, Ridge Road and there's a way to get it.
Okay, that's your, that's the real.
That's what
Yeah, it's a permanent closure. For the, you know, the certain stretches of, beach drive that we're closed. So you close it. Oh, yeah. Switch it from.
About ready, Ken?
Hi, Penny. How are you? Thank you for coming. Hey, well, I don't know if that makes you scares me. No.
I might call it across the way.
Yeah.
So, you know, probably got it the other day.
Hello. Thanks for coming.
I think they should.
It's running. I think he's starting.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My name is Shady Rose. I'm the events manager here at Lost City Books. And before, we are Lost City Books. We are a used, new, and rare bookstore located in the heart of Washington, D.C. The heart because we're here, I think. And we specialize in a very carefully curated selection of books. So if you have the chance to browse our shelves, you notice that they're very tightly packed with a lot of really interesting books because we care a lot about the books that we put on our shelves, which is why we have our guest this evening, Ken Fireman, discussing Unmooring. A few more things before we get started. Please silence your cell phones. Those things can be really loud in a room like this. And we want to give the utmost respect to our speaker this evening. Secondly, if you purchased your book via Eventbrite, come and see me before you leave with it, just so that we can account for that on our little checklist here. Nextly, this event is being live streamed, and while none of you are visible, if you choose to ask a question or offer a comment, that comment or question will be a part of our live stream. Speaking of questions and comments, if you have any questions and comments, please hold them until the end of our event so that we can use our full time to discuss the book as we plan to, and then we'll have plenty of time for everyone to ask questions at the end. And I'd like to introduce to you Ken Fireman. As a young activist, Ken Fireman participated in many of the events narrated in The Unmooring, from civil rights demonstrations to the 1967 March on the Pentagon and the protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention. He went on to a career as a journalist for the Detroit Free Press, Newsday and Bloomsburg News, covering wars and upheaval in Russia and the Persian Gulf, and the inner workings of Washington as a White House and Pentagon correspondent. The Unmooring is his first novel. Everyone, please welcome Ken Fireman. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm really excited to talk about this book, especially because it centers around such a pivotal time in U.S. history. So I want to kind of start just by digging into the setting. That time is, as you know, you wrote about it, right? It was huge and full of both transformative political moments and cultural moments, as well as historic changes to the very fabric of our country that to this day are reverberating. So can you tell us a little bit about why you focused in on this time period and what it meant to you to write about it?
Sure. First of all, before I answer your question, thank you, Shady, and thanks to Lost City Books for doing this. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. I guess I have to hold this close. It's not easy for a first-time author to get traction, and I really appreciate you doing this. And a hearty second to your pitch about the bookstore. I spent about 2 hours wandering around here a couple of weeks ago, and it's a great store. I walked away with a pile of books under my eyes, and I really recommend that you look around. So to finally get around to answering your question, I think the main reason to write any historical novel, at least from my standpoint, is to try to hold a mirror up to our present times, and to show, among other things, to show that we're not so unique, we're not alone. There have been times in the past that have been every bit as fraught with potential and fraught with menace as this time is, and that people have persevered and they've gotten through those times, and used the upheaval to accomplish some things, to make changes, to bring about those changes. So that, I think that's the main reason I wrote this thing and why I focused on this period.
Thank you. As your bio mentioned, something that's really important about this book is that it features a lot of the upheaval of the time and the resistance to, for example, the Vietnam War, but also racial injustice and other injustices that were all wrapped up in the time. Can you tell us a little bit about not just your personal background, having been involved at the time, which is phenomenal already, but how you translated that into fiction in a way that can allow the reader to connect to those events.
Right. So what I tried to do was to weave together a lot of what was going on civil rights protests and upheavals in cities and campus revolts, to weave that together with the political events of the period at sort of the higher level. One of the characters, there's four main characters in the novel, and one of them is a sort of a foreign policy Brahmin. Is the father of the main character is a guy who's been an advisor to Democratic presidents since the Roosevelt administration, and is sort of an eminence grise in the foreign policy setting. And he provides a window into what was going on in the Kennedy administration, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then in the Johnson administration over Vietnam. And he's one of the people who's pushing Johnson, in fact, toward escalation in Vietnam. The other, his wife, whose name is Anna, is started out as a writer and has become sort of a powerhouse political figure within the Democratic Party. So through those two characters, I was able to present a portrayal of events going on in the White House and the administration at high levels of the party, and weave those together with the on the ground events that were going on in places like Selma and Birmingham and its freedom rides.
Thank you. And yes, so I'm glad you mentioned the different levels, because there was at the time so much going on, and the different levels of not just awareness that the average person had, but access to, for one thing, the information, but also the power to enact certain changes at different levels. So can you talk a little bit about how this book explores those power differentials with the different characters, and what that sort of meant for the characters as they're moving through the events of the book?
Right. That will be a nice segue when I get around to reading this segment that I'd like to read. That's a very nice segue into it. But to answer your question, it was a period when, leaders always make history to one degree or another. That's a constant throughout history. What's not a constant is when ordinary people get a chance to make history. And there are moments, there are windows of opportunity, I guess you'd call it, that open up, that allow ordinary people to step up and do things that let them make some history and bring about some change. And, the examples, I guess they're fairly obvious. The Civil War is such an example. The Depression and its aftermath was such an example. And the 60s was an example of that, where a lot of ordinary people, most of them Black, but in some cases white as well, in the early part of that decade, changed America, and changed America by what they did, by what they chose to do. And in my opinion, those people are giants, just enormous figures. And later in the decade, ordinary people, college students, and others also ultimately changed America by putting themselves in the way of a bad war. And it took a long time for that to have any effect, but it did. And so that's, that it seems to me that's one of the characteristics of the era, and the hope of the book is the notion that not just the famous people, not just the bold-faced names bring about important events and change.
Absolutely, and that's a really powerful message and a major theme that seems to run through the book, and it's especially driven home by the way that you write these characters. So I think this is actually a perfect segue into the selection that you have prepared to read.
Okay, let me introduce it by picking up on what we were just talking about. That in any moment of change, there's different levels. There's the upper level, there's the level of legislation and laws and policy changes and elections that produce leaders who can do that. And, that's important. We all understand that that's important. But that's at 30,000 feet. Down at ground level, there are a lot of people living their lives, and there can be a disconnect between those two levels, no matter no matter what's going on at that upper level, no matter how brilliant the leaders seem, and no matter how important the legislation seems, it doesn't always translate into change in real life. So, the section I'd like to read, this occurs this is set in 1965. It's right after the events in Selma, Alabama, that you probably all are familiar with, where John Lewis and some other civil rights demonstrators who were trying to march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the lack of voting rights in Alabama, beaten very badly by cops. And it's just after that and before the next Selma to Montgomery march, the one that attracted thousands of people, including all kinds of celebrities, and was led by Martin Luther King, and also just before the voting rights bill. I should say also Michael, who's one of the main characters, is going down to Alabama to cover the march as a reporter, and Michael is a white journalist, activist turned journalist, and his wife Reva, who is a black actress and also a veteran civil rights activist, is going down with him to join the march, to participate in the march. The night before they were supposed to leave, the phone rang in their apartment. Reva answered and mostly listened through the call, rubbing her temple as if her head suddenly ached. When she put down the receiver, the jaw was clenched and her cheeks were tear-stained. That was my mother. Tommy's in the hospital. He got into some kind of trouble with the police. The cop beat him so badly that he's got a fractured skull, a concussion, and a broken cheekbone. My God, that's terrible. What happened? My mother didn't have a lot of details. It sounds like Tommy and some of his friends were driving out to Jones Beach to meet some other friends and got pulled over in the parkway. His friends are in jail. He's in Long Island Jewish. He was in the intensive care unit at first because he was unconscious when they brought him in, but they moved him to a ward. I guess that's good news, right? Reva slept very little that night. Michael heard her pacing in the living room, alternately crying quietly and swearing softly to himself. Tommy was 20, over 6 feet tall, and a muscular 180 pounds. But to Reva, he was her little brother, and she was fiercely protective of him. They changed to a later flight and headed to the hospital in the morning. The parents, Sam and Dory, were there, sitting next to Tommy's bed. He was asleep, his skull swathed in bandages and more gauze wrapped diagonally around the left side of his face. Sam was holding his hand. He's been awake a little this morning, Dory said. The doctor said that was good, but he's going to be here for several days, they said, and he may need physical therapy after that. Do you know any more about what happened? Reva asked. I talked to one of the kids in the car, Sam said. Tommy wasn't even driving. The kid swears they weren't speeding, weren't doing anything wrong. These cops pulled them over for no reason. When the cops walked up to their car, Tommy rolled down the window and asked why they pulled him over. Not angry, the kid said, not sassy, just asking. The cop told him to get out of the car. When he did, the cop told him he was a smart-mouthed punk and he should keep his black mouth shut. Tommy told him he had no cause to talk to him that night. The cop hit him in the face with his club and then cracked him on the head. The other 3 boys in the car all got hauled in for, get this, resisting arrest, Dory said. Once Tommy's out of the hospital, he'll have to appear on the same charge. Nothing, absolutely nothing. We're driving out to the beach because it was a warm day. For being black and driving out to the beach, Reva said. There was a controlled rage in their voices that Michael had never heard before. He understood its source completely. One glance at the battered young man in the bed was enough to make that clear. At the same time, it rocked him and it frightened him. In Michael's life, injustice was something he cared about, wrote about, fought against, but it was something that happened to other people. something he experienced at a distance. For Rita and her family, it was very personal. And he realized, as he should have known already, that this was not experience. Rita said little on the trip back to the city. When they got home, she told Michael to go to Alabama without him.
All right.
The family's going to need me, she said. And I have to tell you, the way I feel right now, I have no interest in taking part in some great festival of interracial harmony. Michael nodded, but his face must have betrayed his inner unease. I'm glad the march is going to happen, Rita said, trying to explain. I'm glad the government finally got off its ass and sent troops to protect the marchers. I'm glad there's going to be a voting rights bill. But when it's over, America, white America, is going to pat itself on the back for all the wonderful progress it's making, and then go back to business as usual. And we've just had a little taste of what business as usual really is.
Now, this was an incredibly powerful passage for a lot of reasons. So thank you for sharing it, of course. And I think that it represents very well what this novel is attempting to do, if I may say what I think the novel is attempting to do, which is to shine a light on almost the hubris of what we call progress, in that quite literally, after the civil rights movement of the 60s, America patted itself on the back and moved on as if the legacy of these atrocities isn't buried deep in the heart of the nation. So I'm curious about sort of what drew you to that messaging, and how you see it reflected in today's world and some of the issues of perhaps the past couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, just to go backward in time, one of the things that interested me was the differing perceptions of what was going on, particularly in the early 60s, and the comforting illusion that white people in the North told themselves that this is a Southern problem. That there's racism and that's horrible, and it's great that it's great that people are fighting against that, and maybe I'm fighting against it too. And it's great that there's legislation that's going to attack that. But it's not a problem where I live, it's a problem where they live, they meaning white Southerners. And that was a very comforting illusion. It was also a total illusion, as people learn. Some people fairly quickly, others not so quickly, and others never. And that certainly is still going on today, and we see that as recently as the Black Lives Matter protests. That's certainly shown a light on enduring problems that have never been addressed in any meaningful way. When I was growing up in Detroit had a liberal white mayor who was elected in large part with black votes to try to clean up a police force that was white and racist and brutal, and went around in black neighborhoods like an occupant. Detroit was hardly alone in that. I experienced it directly. That was 60 years ago. 60 years ago. So, the other thing I would say is that I think the characters travel kind of a typical arc. The year that I wrote about began in a moment of great idealism, hope, and optimism, and sort of symbolized by Kennedy and his administration. But even more important than that kind of bauble, there was a sense that things were happening. People were doing things in the country. The problems that had festered for years were finally going to be attacked, and that progress was being made. And I think over the course of the decade, there was a downward arc that certainly Michael and Rita experienced, and the whole country experienced. of frustration and ultimately anger. And, by the end of the decade, you've got a country that is bitterly divided, polarized, very violent. I mean, we kind of forget, we think of today as a polarized and violent era. The 60s were much more violent. There were presidential candidate, and the preeminent civil rights leader were all murdered in the space of 63, so 5 years. There were urban uprisings in scores of cities that killed, I don't know what the final death toll was, but it certainly goes into the hundreds. There were, pitched battles in the street between anti-war demonstrators and pro-war hard hats. It was a violent era. And it ended with perhaps the most cynical politician in American history, Richard Nixon, winding up on top and very deliberately using those divisions and exacerbating those divisions, particularly the racial divisions. People called it his Southern strategy. Again, this goes back to the comforting illusions of the Northerners. People called it his Southern strategy, and it was very effective in the South in 1968, but it was just as effective in the North, in a lot of cities, in Detroit and Milwaukee and a bunch of other cities. There were plenty of white Northerners who were quite willing to flock to Nixon's banner as he worked the racial divisions. And so that was a real downward arc thing that was very tragic at the time, and I hope I captured in the moment.
And thank you for bringing that up too, because I feel that the responsibility of this particular story is to, and I hope, maybe you agree, that it captures a very clear example of the cycle that this country continues to go through, where there's a rush of progress and then an era of complacency followed by a downturn. Of course, that can't always be directly mapped onto the historical events in the United States, but observably that seems to be the case.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about how you used these characters as you're moving through the 60s into 68, into Vietnam and all of this, how you use these characters and created lives for them through which you could demonstrate that cycle in a way that does feel so clear.
Well, through Michael, he actually begins as a young activist when he's in college, activist and kind of would-be wannabe journalist. He becomes a professional journalist and sort of tracks that downward arc. At first he can't believe that this country's going into Vietnam. He begins to get into arguments with his father, who said is a foreign policy advisor to Johnson. He begins to get into arguments with him almost in disbelief that anybody could be advocating that we commit, serious military and financial resources to such a peripheral and such a loser of a struggle. And as time goes on, those two characters, Michael and his father Alan, dig themselves in and become really strident, and it actually poisons their relationship as father and son. So that's certainly one way. In Reva's case, she is a Black woman who is trying to make it in New York as an actress and a singer, and she has the talent to do it. But of course, that's always difficult. And she's acutely aware of the fact that she is a Black woman living in a largely white world, a liberal white world that that is about as interracial or biracial as one might find in the early 60s. But it's still a world in which whites dominate and whites make the rules, and men dominate and men make the rules. And so she has to cope with that, and she thinks that she can navigate. She thinks that she can survive without losing, something that's essential to her, which is that she's Black. she thinks she can navigate it. And that becomes difficult. I don't want to avoid spoilers.
Some spoilers. You've got to read the book. You
Yes,
to find out.
Exactly.
But something that we spoke briefly about on the phone a few days ago, that another thing that is central to the purpose of this book is not only to kind of dig deep into the real human stories of this, sorry folks, someone's out drag racing in the street. Dig into the human, like, meaty stories of the era, but also to kind of point a finger at the necessity for humility in people who are from those groups of power that presume to call themselves allies or activists or what have you. And in the excerpt that you just read, there was a very good example of that character being humbled and realizing and recognizing that he actually has no perspective whatsoever on the true experience of that racist violence. So I'm curious a little bit about some of the lessons that you were able to learn in your time during those years working as an activist, but also if in writing this novel you found new ways to articulate that lesson and new ways to sort of to articulate the lesson and bring it to the surface.
Yeah, in terms of my own personal experience, that's absolutely right. The civil rights movement in its early days was very much a biracial, interracial movement. The leaders, for the most part, were Black, but there were whites who played prominent roles. And at a certain point, particularly in the more militant aspects and militant areas of the movement, new Black leaders, like Stokely Carmichael, for example, and SNCC, basically said, "Time for you guys to leave. We need to run our own movement." For a while, it was okay to stay around as secondary figures, but eventually, go form your own groups. And you need to find a way if you want to be our allies, if you want to work with us, that's great. Find a way to reach out to other white people to fight this. And that happened, I think, by the mid-60s, actually. That happened over several years. And of course, that was something that Malcolm X was saying almost from the start of his activism, that, Black people have to form Black organizations and run those organizations for themselves and make their own decisions. So that was something I certainly experienced as an activist. In the case of the characters in the book, just focusing on Michael, he is an extremely well-intentioned person with some real blind spots. He has difficulty again, I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but he frustrates his wife on many occasions because she feels that he just doesn't see racial differences. He doesn't see race, and he looks at that as a virtue. And she does at first. She thinks that's cool, and it's actually one of the things that maybe attracts him to her. But after a while, she begins to see it as a blind spot because she sees race, because she has to, because she has no choice, because the world comes at her. The white world specifically comes at her in a way that she couldn't possibly avoid even if she wanted to. And she grows frustrated with her husband for being either blind or not picking up on it. Certainly.
Thank you. And so let's get into a few more technical questions about your writing of the book, because as your debut novel, this is a heavy hitter, right? So
thank you.
I'd love to
Take that as a compliment.
Yeah, no, I think it certainly is. I'm sure everyone here will agree if you've read the book or once you have. But I want to know a bit more about the process of putting this all together. Did you know when you started, like, oh, I'm going to write a novel about this, and these are the lessons? Or did you start writing a story about something that appealed to you, and then the story generated, or some secret third thing?
So the original conception, years and years ago, the original conception was to write actually a series of novels about an American family, an extended American family, and their journey through the entire 20th century, from starting with the progressive era in the early years of the century. Being vicious, as I thought about that and began to think about how to actually start to accomplish that, it occurred to me that the 60s piece of that was where I should start, partly because I knew it better than anybody. I lived through it and was familiar with it. But also because perhaps certainly as much as any other, maybe more so, it fit that definition that I gave earlier. It was a mirror. It was really a mirror that you could hold up and see. You could see our own era so vividly. And so it was kind of irresistible in that sense.
I like what you said there, because it is such a mirror, that decade, but also it's interesting to think about the people who were major players at that time. Many of them are still alive and still major players in the government or in other organizational structures. And a mistake, in my opinion, that we in the present day tend to make, no matter what class or group we're from, is to think of these events in the 60s or any events of the past, whether it be the AIDS crisis in the 80s or anything like that. We think of them as so far removed and disconnected from present day far too often, right? And something you mentioned just now about how this book and this era and the events therein can act as a mirror. I'm curious about some of the things that you see reflected in present day, and if you see us being, American citizens and culturally the people present and acting here in the United States, if you see us making some of the same mistakes, or do you see areas where people and organizations have learned from the lessons of that era? And just going back to the cycle, is the cycle just repeating wholesale? Are we chipping away at some of the mistakes and getting better every time? What do you think?
I think it's both of the above. I certainly think the cycle that you talked about is very much present today, and you can trace it in our own time. Certainly, Obama's election in 2008 was, a moment of tremendous hope, and was supposed to initiate a new era of reform, a new version of the New Deal, the Great Society. Well, that lasted about 18 months, I think. And it accomplished some things, about the passage of the ACA and the passage of the big stimulus bill that got us out of the Great Recession. I mean, that's not nothing, that's something. But it sure didn't last. The very facile kind of, in retrospect, very foolish kind of construction that some people made when Obama was elected. We're entering a post-racial era now looks utterly laughable. And you can trace the downward arc from that moment of great hope down to 2016 in Trump and everything that's followed. And what last Tuesday means, I don't know. It's maybe a turn in the right direction, maybe just a temporary ceasefire, but you can certainly see that cycle. I guess I see progress made in each of these periods, in each of these cycles. They're windows of opportunity. They never last very long. Some of them last longer than others, but they never last forever. They inevitably end and produce disillusionment, but I think each cycle moves the ball forward. That's my sense. Not as much as we need to, and there is always a residue of unfinished business, and that residue of the unfinished business is always much longer than what's been accomplished. But I think, I mean, it's a famous quote from Martin Luther King, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I think I believe in that.
I think I agree. I've seen, even just in the past few years, I've seen us as a species learn something. Now, if we can, climate conversation, we'll see, we'll see about that, right?
Amen.
I'm laughing, but it's really not something, is it? So let's talk a little bit more about the family as a vehicle. You mentioned that originally this was going to be a very ambitious project throughout several years.
I'm not done yet. So,
Sequel?
yeah, absolutely.
Um, uh, Sorry, let's talk about the family as the driving vehicle of the plot in the book. I think that's a really significant choice, and I wonder if you can tell us why you chose to make this about family and closely related people like that, rather than just a scattering of random people, for example.
Well, the short answer is you wrote that. It's just a better, a family is a better narrative device. But I mean, that's kind of a facile answer. I mean, there's more to it than that. I think families are always fraught. There's always a lot of love, and there's also always a lot of competition and edginess. And it provides a vehicle for exploring political differences and cultural differences and perceptual differences and generational tension. And that was certainly a theme of the big part of the 60s. And also going back to a mirror is certainly a big part of what's going on today. Generational tensions between generations over how to change the society that is often stubbornly resistant to change. I chose to make Michael, the main character, come from a very privileged family, not multi-billionaire family, but politically privileged, a Washington power couple. I thought that would be an interesting vehicle for two reasons. One, as I said earlier, through his mother and father, because they're Washington power figures, that gave them a narrative way into exploring those events. But it also allowed me to have him rebel against that, to explore his rebellious side, to explain and show, not just explain, but show how he became an activist, why he became an activist. He finds his parents and their worldview stultifying. He finds Washington stultifying as well. Doesn't really like Washington very much. Moves to New York. Makes a very conscious decision to turn his back on his parents. And I've just seen the book.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My last question, and then we can get into some of the questions from our wonderful audience members, is, like I said, the book is a powerhouse. It's jam-packed with not only the many real events that happened in the United States, which is a challenging way to write a novel. You could easily have chosen to just write fiction about a fictional country where fictional things happen.
Sometimes I wish it was fiction.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's slow.
But by choosing to attack and delve into this time, what you have accomplished is kind of opening up a dusty old flower of some kind. And my metaphors are mixing here, but the point is that it's shining a very illuminating light on an era that, like I said earlier, some folks are either heroizing, glorifying, or forgetting the details altogether. So for the average reader, for the person who reads this book, knowing nothing going in, what do you hope strikes them the most about what you wrote?
It's an interesting question. Glad you asked it. I hope they see that we're not alone in our times, that other people have struggled with very similar issues and found a way through. I hope they see that ordinary people can make a big difference in the lives of their country and world. I hope to see how ordinary people can become giants when they rise to the occasion and do things that they probably didn't even realize that they could do beforehand. I hope they see a world that needs to get better and that needs good people needs to make it, whatever that is, whatever it takes.
Thank you. That's good. That's very good. Thank you. Now we do have time for questions from one of the audience members. If you have questions or comments.
Just on the title, where did this title come from? What's this?
Well, I hope it works two ways. One is that America became very unruly in the 60s. The 50s were at least perceived as a period of stability and everything was fine. Not really true, but that was the perception. In the 60s, all hell broke loose. So the country became unruly. The two main characters, their lives also became unruly in their relationship. So hopefully it works on two different levels. That was the intent.
I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit about your own biography and points at which the protagonists in your novel correspond to your own personal experience.
Well, not that much actually, because the main character is a journalist and I'm a journalist, but very different track. I did not grow up in my parents were not a power couple. I grew up in Detroit, kind of a lower middle class neighborhood. My father was a gas station mechanic. My mother was a secretary. So, they weren't solving the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, I was a journalist for a long period of time. I covered the White House, covered the Pentagon, covered wars. And I certainly used that experience to try to one of the things I wanted to do was to put the reader in the scene of events in the way that a reporter would experience them, because a reporter covering an event is really on the ground and seeing it, not seeing the whole picture by any means, but certainly seeing in a very immediate way what's going on. And so I put Michael in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, for example, as a way to put the reader in that moment, that very seminal moment. And I use my experience as a reporter to try to bring verisimilitude to those moments. Before that, I was an activist. I was, back when I was a teenager, I was walking on civil rights picket lines in Detroit, which was a northern city. It was a very active, sort of a hotbed of civil rights activism for the North. And later in anti-Vietnam War protests, I was in the CS for a while, occupied a couple buildings down there. And so, all those experiences, I hope, helped bring to life. I mean, there's a partial chapter on the Columbia University student revolt in 1968, which I was not part of personally, but I had enough similar experiences that I hope I was able to bring some verisimilitude to that narration.
Ken, I greatly enjoy the capacity of the book to put the reader on the spot when things happen at the right position with a good angle to see and explore these events through history. And I guess at the end of the book, I ended up feeling a sense of how interesting this country is and how interesting the problems that it has faced are. And it taught me a lesson of hope And, the current events, political events and these elections are a demonstration that yes, there is a fiber, a democratic fiber that is strong and can flex anytime. And Michael is that representation of the truth and the belief in democracy. So I enjoy it very much.
Thank you. Thanks. There's an old curse you probably have heard. We live in interesting times. It is a curse, so better for worse.
Ken, you quoted Martin Luther King talking about the arc of justice is long and start justice. Do you feel that's true universally? I mean, outside the United States as well as in the United States?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Not certainly not universally, but if you look at the long arc of history in Europe, in what used to be the colonial world, and just in my lifetime, which is not everyone's. Most of Asia and Africa has gone from being colonial possessions of a few European powers to being independent countries, not without their own huge problems. How many people thought that apartheid was going to basically dissolve over a relatively short period of time and relatively peacefully? And not, I don't want to push that too far, but far less bloodshed in that process than some people feared. The collapse of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I lived in Russia for 3.5 years, right at the point where the Soviet Union was collapsing in the aftermath. And, again, God knows the Russian people deserve so much better than what they're getting. And, what has happened in the last 20 years, I think is terrible. But, the end of that empire, the end of that Soviet system was a great victory, regardless of what has happened since then. So, yeah, I think, again, it goes back to what I was saying before. These cycles occur and the windows of change open and they close pretty quickly, but each time things move forward on the whole. And I hope that someday the Russian people are able to enjoy what they deserve, which is a decent leadership and a decent society. And they certainly don't have it now. But I hope someday they will. And Slava Ukraine, because the Ukrainians are taking.
Excuse me, what do you mean by Ukrainians are taking?
They are taking their fate into their own hands. They have, how many people thought that they were going to be able to successfully resist the Russian invasion? They've done it. They've done more than that. Just this week, they recaptured Kherson. And they're forging a nation. I think what we're seeing, Ukraine has always been a nation. Putin is utterly wrong. I apologize. Putin is utterly wrong in saying that there's no such thing as the Ukrainian nation. There has always been a Ukrainian nation, but it's been kind of a contingent and indefinite thing. I think what we have seen since February 24th is Ukrainians, partly through the very heroic leadership of someone like Zelensky, but more important through what they are doing, those civilians and soldiers. They are forging their own nation in the crucible of a terrible unjust war. And I don't mean to downplay the terrible suffering and the bloodshed and the misery that war has created. But if there is any silver lining, it is that under the pressure of that invasion, Ukraine is becoming Ukraine. And so, Slava Ukraini is not just a slogan, I think it's something to wish from the heart. And, end of, end of stump speech on that subject.
So I just had a question sort of more about the writing. Which is, was it difficult for you to write in the vernacular of the times? I think about the big challenge of writing history being to avoid what is called Protestantism, is to impute today's value system on times long ago. But it's only been, like you said, 60 years ago. Did you struggle with that at all? Like, did you like write some dialogue and say, wait a minute, I'm reflecting right now a much more sophisticated analysis of systemic racism, for example, that simply didn't exist among white people back then. How did you sort of deal with that?
Well, I tried to avoid vernacular as much as possible, and just try to write in, a natural voice, but not, I don't, I didn't feel comfortable kind of impersonating people. With a few exceptions, I did kind of try to capture Lyndon Johnson's saltiness in his language, which is very well documented.
Plenty of audio on that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I tried to, I did a lot of research, listened to a lot of, including a lot of tapes and a lot of videotapes, and I just tried to, with my ear, I tried to capture how people were talking as much as I could, and then put that on the page without trying to look, without trying to be effective.
We're looking forced.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not finished with it, but you've achieved it as far as I've been reading.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ken, how did you research Reba? I mean, I've heard that it's difficult to write of a different sex, I could see you writing about Michael, and having that male point of view and white point of view. But how did you research her?
Yeah. I can see some people looking, reading the book and deciding that what I did with Reva was an enormous act of hubris. And I understand that point of view. I felt that I had to do it because it was the story I had to tell. And this may sound a little weird, but at a certain point when you're writing a novel, characters actually take on a life of their own. And a lot of times, they run far ahead of you. So it was the story I had to tell, and she was part of it. More specifically, I talked to some people, read a lot, talked to people, tried to expand my knowledge as much as I could. And I don't know if I succeeded. That's for other people to judge. I hope I have.
You did. You did.
I
Get
hope so.
inside the skin of an African American woman.
I'm sorry.
I think you managed to get inside the skin.
Well, I don't know that I would make that claim for myself, but I appreciate it.
Well,
I tried. And again, it was the story. It was a story I felt that was like in my head. Until I told it.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you.
Lastly, for our audience and our viewers at home, where can we keep up with you and maybe send you emails to demand a sequel for
Please do, demand away. The email address is khfireman@verizon.net, and you are welcome to email me. I'm on Twitter at kfireman1. Welcome to DM me through that.
Do you have a blue mark?
I do, and I don't know how I got it. I mean, it's really weird. I've been on Twitter for, I don't know, 10, 12 years. And it appeared one day. I don't even remember asking for it. I think maybe because I was a journalist, they just started handing them out. Yeah, so,
Well, now you have to pay, I think.
well, they've canceled them. They've canceled them, yeah. So, but anyway, please do let me know what you think of the novel, if you have thoughts. I also, I should add that I have a website, kenfireman.com. There's a comment section there that you can use to reach. And I would really love it if you contacted me in any way that you want to.
Wonderful. Thanks again so much, and thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you.
I'm sorry? If you want to buy the book, you can ask Ken to sign it here, and you can buy it downstairs.
Go ahead. I will be glad.
Ken, is there gonna be an audio version of it?
Oh, no, audio.